Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Christoph Dressler. I direct the Go Learn program at the University of Utah. These posters behind me tell some stories. It's faculties that will take anyone who would like to join us on a trip, and usually it's a more meaningful trip. And sadly, as you all know, we're kind of like cooped up at home, and we need to bring the road to you instead of us getting on a bus and hitting the road. Today, we're here with Professor Elizabeth Archuleta. She's a professor at the Ethnic Studies in the division in the School of Culture and Social Transformation at the University of Utah. She has a BA in English from Westminster. So since Westminster College is just down the road from us here, we're mentioning that, and a BA and a PhD from Penn State.
MA, PhD. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
An MA and PhD from Penn State.
Yep, MA and PhD in English. So
right.
She teaches Indigenous Studies. It's quite a list, actually. American Indian Literature, Pacific Island Literature, American Indian Women, which is currently a class she's giving, Diversity Scholars Program, Race, Gender, and Popular Culture, and probably many more things. And Professor Archuleta is coming out with a new book soon. She has a few, but I want to mention this one. It's called This is the Plate, Utah Food Ways. So as you know, when the first settlers came here, there's a place up here, it's called This is the Place, apparently what Brigham Young shouted out when he saw the valley that is now Salt Lake City. For those who are not from Salt Lake City, we're welcoming everyone to this. Far and near, I hope. This is also brought to you by the Alumni Association. So we hopefully have a bunch of alumni here with us and listening today about New Mexico and a few thoughts and knowledge that Professor Archuleta will bring to us instead of taking us on the trip. If everything changes and we are able to travel, then we will go in August to New Mexico, discovering many places that Elizabeth can bring closer to us. So thank you for everyone for joining. If you run your cursor over your screen, you see a Q&A and a chat. You can post your questions there. In about 45 minutes or 50 minutes or so, we will take those questions. I will kind of make myself invisible and let Elizabeth take over.
Thank you, everyone, for showing up for my presentation. I just want to let you know my dog's in the room with me, and his water dish is like right back here. So if you hear him, that's him making noise. So Christoph started by telling you a little bit about my background. Yes, all my degrees are in English with a focus on contemporary American literature, Southwestern literature with an emphasis on Native American literature. So the one thing that I learned is that, to better understand authors and the works that they've published, you have to understand the history and the background of the author and the places where they came from. So some of the authors I was looking at were from New Mexico, so I began digging into New Mexico's past. I'm sharing an image of Chris Wilson's book here because it was one that I read and fell in love with when I was in grad school. And he takes a historical journey through Santa Fe, but he does it through the lens of architecture, which is his area of research, but it's filled with narratives and history and photos. So it's more than just a book on architecture. He traces Santa Fe's history and its development as a tourist destination. So much of what I learned from him helped me learn more about New Mexico, which is where my family originally comes from. But what I learned is that much of what we know and what tourists know about New Mexico was manufactured by Anglo newcomers, thus the myth that is included in his title. So for me, he filled in the history of the state where my family's from, and so I wanted to share a little bit more about my family. This is my grandma, my maternal grandmother. She came from the northern part of the state, which is still pretty rural and economically depressed. And she first moved to Utah when she was about 15. She wanted to escape the poverty and find something new. And so her and three friends, they all decided when we turned 15, we're going to get married because that was the marriageable age then, and that they would marry and then they could leave. Well, she ended up coming to Utah on her own and still single, and everybody else chickened out. But she went to her godmother's boarding house at Tooele Army Depot and worked for her godmother at the boarding house. Well, her dad, my great grandpa, came and took her home because it wasn't proper for a young single woman to be working around so many men. This happened 3 times. She ran away to Tooele. My grandpa came and brought her back home. And she did that until she met my grandpa, who is pictured here. My grandma's carrying my mom, and the little girl standing in between them is my Aunt Linda, her older sister. And this picture was taken somewhere west of Tooele. And over the years, she brought all of her brothers and sisters to live in Utah. And she enlisted all of her brothers into the military. And so that's how we ended up here. Every summer we would caravan, cars, 3 or 4 or 5 cars of family members, and we'd go back to New Mexico every summer and stay with my great grandma. She lived in a small mountain village north of Santa Fe and southeast of Taos. No electricity, and as I said, no indoor plumbing, no heating. So it was always an adventure to go visit her. But I got to live there and experience life in New Mexico as a resident when I worked at the University of New Mexico. That was my first job out of grad school. So when people think of New Mexico, which included myself, they think of hatch chili, turquoise, squash blossom necklaces, American Indians, pottery, and art. But there's much more to the state that most people don't know about, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you here today. So for the next 45 minutes, I think, I want to step back in time and share some of what I've learned about New Mexico in order to provide some context for the Golden Trip next August, if the pandemic is over. So I wanted to begin by posing a rhetorical question. What do all of the following have in common? Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, Tuberculosis, the Railroad, Fred Harvey, and Santa Fe style architecture. The answer is that each of these helped New Mexico achieve statehood, believe it or not. It took New Mexico 66 years to move from territory to state, and that's the longest of any territory. In fact, the territory introduced at least 50 unsuccessful bids for statehood. So you'll see how everything on today's agenda right here contributed to this eventual success. New Mexico first applied for statehood in 1850 when the Compromise of 1850 designated it a territory. The Compromise of 1850 was made up of 5 bills that attempted to resolve disputes over slavery in new territories that were added to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War. The Compromise admitted California as a free state, and it left the territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves whether to be slave or free. New Mexico and Arizona eventually became separate territories in 1863 after Congress passed the Arizona Organic Act. This divided New Mexico territory in half, and it abolished slavery in Arizona territory. Disclaimer, this map it doesn't reflect reality. But it does illustrate an ongoing problem for Arizona and New Mexico territories, that neither had enough people to be admitted as states. New Mexico's 1850 bid for statehood wasn't achieved because it was told that they didn't have the population numbers required for statehood, which I believe was around 60,000 residents. Arizona didn't meet the requirement either. In fact, at the beginning of the 20th century, it still only had 5,000 residents. As a result, several proposals were floated to bring the 2 territories into the Union together as just one state. The 1903 plan proposed that this superstate be named Montezuma. This wasn't the first time the Aztec emperor's name was appropriated. In 1887, leaders in New Mexico proposed switching their territory's name to Montezuma, figuring it would make statehood more palatable to Americans who weren't too fond of any implied association with old Mexico. This ploy wasn't successful either. Trinkline's book that I'm showing here is an interesting foray into other state names that didn't hold either. At around the same time period, in 1880, territorial leaders had been devising ways to increase New Mexico's population. This is when they began to appeal to people with tuberculosis. Before New Mexico became the land of enchantment, it was dubbed the land of sunshine or the heart of well country. These slogans were designed to lure tuberculosis patients to the territory. And you can see on the map on the right that there were 60 sanatoriums that cropped up all over the territory. Tuberculosis was once the leading cause of death in the United States. There was no pharmaceutical cure that existed until 1943, so doctors prescribed a climate cure, hoping that dwelling somewhere arid and sunny with lots of fresh air would dry out patients' lungs and help them beat the disease. As early as 1880, thousands of people journeyed to New Mexico for its climate, making it a haven for tuberculosis sufferers hoping to heal, and many stayed, making it their home. Included here are some of the individuals who came for the cure, including the woman on the right who's using a practice called heliotherapy, where a mirror is used to direct the sun's rays down her throat to dry out her lungs. Edgar Lee Hewitt came to New Mexico as well because his wife Cora had TB. Cora serendipitously helped focus her husband's attention on archaeology, and his name is attached to many of the movers and shakers of the time period in New Mexico. He's best known for his role in moving New Mexico towards statehood in several ways. He's the founder and director of the Museum of New Mexico, pictured here on this magazine cover. El Palacio is the oldest museum magazine of its kind, first published in 1913 by the museum. El Palacio, which means the palace, refers to the Museum of New Mexico's first home. The State Museum was created by an act of territorial legislation in 1909, 3 years before New Mexico became a state. It was established in the Palace of the Governors with the School of American Archaeology alongside the already existing Historical Society of New Mexico. He's the founding director of New Mexico Normal School in Las Vegas, not to be confused with Nevada's Las Vegas. It was later renamed New Mexico Normal University, and it's now called New Mexico Highlands University, which is still in operation. He also played a significant role in the formation of Bandolier National Monument and Chaco Culture National Historical Park, both of which were established to preserve the extensive prehistoric ruins of the Pueblo people whom he studied. He also helped gain passage of the Antiquities Act, which was a pioneering piece of legislation for the conservation movement. It was the first United States law that protected any general kind of cultural natural resource, such as those shown in the images here. I've never even been to those places myself, so I'm going to have to go visit them. After his wife's death, Hewitt became the founding director of the School of American Archaeology, now known as the School of American Research. It's pictured here as it appears today, and as you can see, it's beautiful. The grounds are beautiful, and there's small cabins on site because they house scholars in residence, and so they have access to their library. They have their own printing press. They host lectures. There's a lot of things going on there. So I'd recommend going to their website to check out what they do and what they offer. And as you can see, Hewitt had many roles that he wore many hats, which meant he hired and worked with people who have also become synonymous with New Mexico. He was instrumental in establishing San Ildefonso Pueblo as a center for Native American pottery. His dealings with Maria Martinez, the renowned San Ildefonso Pueblo potter, helped stimulate the rebirth of pottery as a significant form of folk art. Her pottery became highly sought after, and her innovative, highly polished and matte painted black on black style became among the most popular style of pottery, which made her and her husband, Julian Martinez, famous. She told a story about this style of pottery because it was actually a mistake. She didn't mean to create this style, but it happened during the firing process. Her and Julian sold their pottery to a shop. And once, when they didn't have enough pots to give him to sell to tourists, Julian took over the pieces of pottery that were black like this and told him that they were special pottery. And those pots sold so well that the owner had asked for more, and the rest is history. She also signed all of her pots to authenticate that they were hers, but she also helped community members by signing her name on their pots as well. So you can imagine that buyers and collectors were very unhappy with this, because now it's harder for them to authenticate what pots are really hers. But she recognized her fame and wanted to help her community members earn a living as well making pottery, so she did this for them. Another person who worked with Hewitt was Carlos Vieira, who also traveled to New Mexico as a health seeker in 1904. Like many individuals in this time period, he did many things. He was an artist, archaeologist, architect, and photographer, among many other things. This is his home pictured here. After he died, an editorial published the day after his death stated, "It was Vieira's insistence upon purity of style that saved Santa Fe from many an architectural monstrosity." And this shows where his influence is in architecture. Vieira was a pivotal figure in a small circle that conceived of and created the Spanish Pueblo Revival style of architecture, which I'll talk about at the end of my presentation. Hewitt also hired Kenneth Chapman, another health seeker who arrived in New Mexico in 1899. Chapman was involved in mapping archaeological ruins, judging Pueblo pottery, teaching art, and studying ancient and modern Indian design. When he moved to Santa Fe in 1909, he found himself in the midst of the city's identity crisis, modernize or preserve tradition. And again, that'll be part of the presentation on architecture. Eventually, he played a part in virtually all of the central institutions and critical events that shaped Santa Fe as we know it today. Kate Chapman, Kenneth's wife, moved to Santa Fe when she was 24. She designed adobe houses and directed restoration projects that returned buildings to their original style. Again, my discussion of architecture is at the end, so I'll be saying more about what I mean by restoration projects that Kate was involved in. She also had a strong activist side and helped defeat what's called the Bursum Bill, which would have taken sovereign lands from Pueblo peoples. She also halted the purchase of land by a group of Texas women who wanted to establish a culture colony on the site. Her and artist friend Dorothy Stewart quietly purchased the land as the proposal was being brought forward in order to protect the site. I wish I knew more about the Texas group and the colony that they wanted to build and the site they wanted to build it on. But unfortunately, that's all I know. So I should probably get my hands on this book that I'm showing you here and read a little bit more about Kate myself. The last person I'll introduce you to was poet and writer Alice Corbin Henderson. But she's definitely not the least of the people who moved to New Mexico as health seekers with tuberculosis that helped to impact the push for statehood, or that even shaped how we see New Mexico and Santa Fe today. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1916. At the recommendation of her doctor, Alice and her husband, on the right, artist William Penhallow Henderson, moved to Santa Fe so she could recuperate. Like so many others who journeyed there to seek treatment, they made it their home. Also, like many others, they both became activists on behalf of land rights and Native American civil rights. They helped co-found and build the House of Navajo Religion, later renamed the Museum of Navajo Ceremonial Art, and currently called the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian. Alice was the curator of this facility. So far in my presentation, I've traced the influence that tuberculosis had on the territory, and it's easy to see how outsiders who made New Mexico their home helped shape and influence what makes New Mexico and Santa Fe popular right now, which are Pueblo ruins, Pueblo pottery, national monuments, and Santa Fe style architecture. This exodus of people to New Mexico was aided by the Bureau of Immigration, whose charge was to lure rich and powerful people to New Mexico for more than just a cure. They lured them to the territory to help win statehood. According to Nancy Owen Lewis, whose book's featured here, territorial officials founded the Bureau of Immigration in 1880 and charged them with furthering the cause of statehood. In her research, she found that much of their effort was tied to bolstering the economy and population by getting lungers, which TB sufferers were called, to relocate to New Mexico. The first sanatoriums were created by the federal government at abandoned military forts to treat sick soldiers and veterans. Other sanatoriums were run by religious orders and by private investors and doctors. It was this third category in which Lewis finds officials putting their hopes. What she found in the archives surprised her. She writes, "What I gathered from reading this literature is that the Bureau of Immigration didn't really care if these people had TB, as long as they were Anglo. They needed them to come out here and change the demographic by making New Mexico's population more American, which she reads as meaning whiter, more Protestant, and better educated." Though it was never put expressly that way in the literature, she says that she considers the implication to be pretty clear, which was New Mexico had trouble achieving statehood because the territory lacked a sufficient population of white people. After signing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1850, which ended the Mexican-American War, the U.S. had never acquired a territory with such a large non-white population so quickly. The dark gray area of the map shows the swath of territory that had become part of the United States, along with the people who had called it home when it was still Mexican territory. At one point after the annexation, General William T. Sherman, a Union general during the Civil War, was quoted as saying, "The United States ought to declare war on Mexico and make it take back New Mexico." Although New Mexico eventually had roughly twice the 60,000 residents required to become a state, its leaders struggled to win over lawmakers in D.C. Its major hurdle was its largely non-white population who were viewed as foreign. They were primarily Catholic, they spoke Spanish, were viewed as poor, and the territory had a reputation for lawlessness. Many Americans and lawmakers were skeptical that New Mexicans were loyal and worthy of becoming American citizens. Another war in 1898 would give New Mexicans the opportunity to prove their loyalty, and this was the Spanish-American War. In 1898, President McKinley sent a telegram to New Mexico Territory's governor. He asked him to assist in recruiting young men who were good shots and good riders to join Roosevelt's famous Rough Riders, the first U.S. volunteer cavalry. New Mexicans proved their loyalty through their willingness to fight on behalf of the United States and Cuba. When Roosevelt became president, he professed his support for New Mexico statehood, partly in gratitude to New Mexicans who served in his Rough Riders regiment. Still, statehood wasn't achieved during his tenure. At the same time that New Mexico was being touted as having a climate salubrious for chasing the cure, and New Mexicans were proving their loyalty, the territory also began developing a reputation for something far removed from the medical industry. The territory became an exotic tourist destination whose reputation began to rival the European tours that were so popular for Americans in the late 19th century. What aided in this effort was the railroad. These are advertisements from 1898 and the 1940s, promoting rail as the fastest and most comfortable way to travel. However, early on, rail travel was anything but comfortable. They were strictly focused on transportation. Food preparation and service wasn't part of their business model, therefore food supplies were unreliable, quality meat was a rarity, and produce was almost never available. And if decent food was on hand, there was never enough to feed a trainload of hungry people. One man who worked for the railroad recognized the awful food and deplorable conditions that travelers encountered, and he created an entirely new industry that we take for granted today, the hospitality industry, along with the chain hotels, restaurants, and service workers. This man was Fred Harvey. He almost single-handedly shaped tourism in the Southwest and helped engineer New Mexico into the land of enchantment. As a young immigrant from England, Harvey worked his way up from dishwasher to household name, beginning in New York and then Kansas, where he got his first job with the railroad. He was Ray Kroc before McDonald's, J. Willard Marriott before Marriott Hotels, or Howard Schultz before Starbucks. His eating houses and hotels along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, including historic lodges still in use at the Grand Canyon, were patronized by princes, presidents, and countless ordinary travelers looking for the best cup of coffee in the country. And as you can see, he even marketed his own brand of coffee. Harvey was a perfectionist and believed in standardization in order to provide travelers with a consistent experience. His restaurants and hotels, better known as Harvey Houses, created a consistent experience for travelers by standardizing menus and sleeping accommodations and providing high-quality dining and hotel services. He established a business partnership with Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad Company, which became a launching pad for the Fred Harvey Company and its first national chain of restaurants, retail stores, and hotels within the railroad's train stations. But first he had to find the right kind of employees. Finding and retaining good waiters was an ongoing problem. The West was rough, and staff often showed up for work hungover with their faces bruised and cut from brawling the night before. The solution might be obvious, but from our vantage point at the time, it was revolutionary. Fred Harvey decided to fire all the waiters and replace them with women. But not just any women. He ran ads in Midwest and East Coast newspapers looking for women 18 to 30 years old who were single, wholesome, cultured, attractive, intelligent, and of good moral character. Thousands applied. Young women anxious to leave their friends, families, and comfortable middle-class lives behind responded. It wasn't because they were excited about becoming waitresses. It was because working for Harvey would be a grand adventure. It meant they could travel west, see new and exotic places, encounter Indians, and interact with travelers from all over the country. And it didn't hurt that they were moving to an area where single men outnumbered available women by huge margins. His new employees received a basic wage plus tips. Train travel was free and room and board were provided. They lived in dormitories and were closely supervised. They had to observe a curfew and were not allowed to wear makeup or jewelry. They had to sign on for a full year and agree to forfeit half their base pay if they married before the year was up. The introduction of his new staff increased customer satisfaction and attracted even more locals to the restaurants. Additionally, the sudden appearance of a steady stream of attractive, intelligent young women into small, isolated Western towns caused quite the stir. The reputation of a Harvey house was very important, and these girls were not referred to as waitresses. They were called Harvey Girls in order to instill a sense of pride in the women selected. His all-female wait staff became America's first national corps of independent working women, making the Fred Harvey Company an industry leader in providing quality jobs for single women. The Harvey Girls were forever memorialized when MGM released The Harvey Girls in 1946, starring Judy Garland in a tale of adventure and romance that ends in marriage. The film depicted another experience of his wait staff. The Harvey Girls not only brought great food and dining to the American West, they also brought love. While they were strictly forbidden to fraternize with Harvey House guests, historians estimate that of the over 100,000 girls employed in the restaurants and hotels, around 20,000 became the wives of the regular customers. One railroad owner said, "The Harvey House wasn't only a good place to eat, it was the Cupid of the rails." American humorist Will Rogers said of the Harvey Girls that they kept the West in food and wives. By 1902, train travel to the Southwest was waning, so the Fred Harvey Company created an Indian department and commissioned artists and photographers and ethnographers to document and share the unique experience of Southwest Indian tribes. The company established relationships with Native American artists and craftspeople in the Pueblos and the Navajo Nation, and it opened gift shops featuring their silver jewelry, baskets, textiles, and pottery. Travelers could purchase pottery and jewelry at train stops or in the shops he opened up at rail stations, as depicted in the photos and postcards in the slide that Harvey produced. The shops carried museum quality works and were often staffed by Native artists themselves. So in addition to food and hospitality, the company ventured into the retail world and introduced rail travelers to the richness and complexity of Native culture and history. In 1926, Harvey devised a solution for train passengers who wanted a more in-depth experience of the Southwest, and the company called this the Indian Detours. They were culturally oriented excursions lasting 2 or 3 days, and featured here are pamphlets designed to promote interest and lure people westward. On the detours, tourists were whisked away from Harvey hotels by a fleet of Harvey cars, which consisted of the latest Franklins, Packards, Cadillacs, and White Motor Company buses. And that's the Palace of the Governors that all the cars are parked in front of. The detours were designed for educated, experienced travelers, and it took them to places they couldn't visit on their own. New Mexico's rugged terrain, the lack of decent roads, and the isolation of many villages meant detour participants enjoyed unique travel experiences, spectacular scenery, ancient ruins, and small Spanish colonial towns. But the highlight of the Indian detours was the Pueblos. Some of New Mexico's Pueblos were relatively accessible, and the residents were used to seeing tourists troop through on a regular basis. However, the Pueblos on the Indian detours were different. They were remote and usually closed to outsiders. As the Fred Harvey Company was designing the itineraries for the detours, they reached out to representatives of several Pueblos and received permission to bring their clients in. The drivers were always men, but once again, the couriers or tour guides were all women. They were sophisticated, outgoing, and well-educated. They had to be at least 25 years old and extremely knowledgeable about the Southwest. A working knowledge of Spanish and local Indian dialects were also helpful. Many were daughters of prominent New Mexicans, including doctors, federal judges, and even a senator. Like the Harvey Girls, they had a standard uniform. They dressed in Navajo-style outfits that included velveteen blouses and skirts, squash blossom necklaces, and concha belts. When a courier completed her training, she received a silver badge bearing the Indian Detours Thunderbird logo. Some attached the badges to their hat bands, as you can see with the couriers on the left, and others pinned them to their blouses. All couriers had to complete a rigorous training program on local geography, geology, plants and animals, native cultures, history, art, and archaeology. They were expected to provide accurate, interesting, in-depth information about the places and people visited on the detours. It was also critical that they expand on topics that interested visitors, as well as answer all of their questions. So once again, the Fred Harvey Company was an industry leader in providing quality jobs for women in the American West. Now for the word dude. It had a different connotation in the 1920s than it does now. It referred to rich people from the East who vacationed on Western ranches and pretended to be cowboys and cowgirls. These establishments came to be known as dude ranches, and travelers on the Indian detours were called dudes, no matter their gender, including the flappers depicted in the image on the left, petting the goat. Dudes came from all over the world to participate in Indian detours. Some famous people who toured with the Fred Harvey Company include Eleanor Roosevelt, the Guggenheims, John D. Rockefeller, Mary Pickford, Will Rogers, and Albert Einstein, who's featured in a headdress in the image on the right. The company had been confident that there was a market for the Indian detours, but demand far exceeded their expectations. Many of those who took the first tours were newspaper and magazine writers. Their glowing accounts of their experiences reached thousands of people. and coverage was extensive, especially in New York and Los Angeles. And the Fred Harvey Company promoted their detours by sending brochures to travel agents nationwide and by placing colorful posters in train stations. Demand began to decline after the stock market crash in 1929, and the slump continued through the Depression and World War II. With its long history of catering to travelers, Fred Harvey and his company are credited with creating Southwestern cultural tourism. Some Harvey buildings are still standing. Pictured here is the Belen Harvey House Museum, and it's an actual trackside Harvey House restaurant. It dates from 1910 and is largely as it was in the heyday of train travel. It has Fred Harvey and Santa Fe memorabilia on display, including dishes, uniforms, posters, vintage photos, and kitchen equipment. The Harvey Girls lived in the second floor dormitory, which you can also tour. This is about a 30 to 45-minute drive south of Albuquerque. And the Go Learn trip won't be visiting this spot, but I wanted to point it out as one of the buildings that Harvey owned that's still standing. Another Harvey property that's still in use is La Fonda Hotel on the plaza in Santa Fe. Although the hotel has been updated over the years, it represents the architectural style made famous by the individuals I mentioned earlier, like Carlos Vieira. And I believe Go Learn travelers will be staying here during our visits, so I hope I'm correct on that. Fred Harvey has two properties in Las Vegas, New Mexico that are still in use, or one is still in use, this one in particular. It's the Montezuma. It's pictured above in this slide, and it's a luxury resort at the time, but is now part of United World College, which is a 2-year boarding school founded by industrialist and philanthropist Armand Hammer. Again, we see the popularity of the name Montezuma. And another Harvey location is the Castaneda, which is also in Vegas. This one is empty, but it's scheduled to undergo renovations from my understanding. So you've learned how tuberculosis shifted New Mexico's demographics in a way that state boosters hoped would help politicians perceive the territory more favorably as they tried to achieve statehood. Next, you learned how Fred Harvey created New Mexico's tourism industry and brought many rich and influential people to the region. Finally, we can't forget the state's well-known architectural style, which I'll talk about now. When the Americans under General Stephen Kearny arrived in New Mexico in August 1846, they didn't find what they'd expected. What they saw were buildings totally alien to what they were accustomed to seeing in Anglo-American architecture. Soldier James Bennett described Las Vegas, New Mexico as a great pile of unbaked brick, adding, upon closer inspection, everything about the town was dirty and filthy with miserable streets that all look alike. The town of Mora was described by another soldier, Frank Edwards, as consisting of a few mud huts. Santa Fe didn't inspire admiration either, with one traveler likening it to a dilapidated brick kiln or a prairie dog town. Chris Wilson, whose book I featured in my initial slide, wrote that Americans equated adobe buildings with loose women, gambling, cowardice, a lack of proper hygiene, and immoral clergy, all symptoms of the decline of Christian civilization in New Mexico. In order to achieve statehood, newcomers wanted to see the architecture of progress, meaning they wanted to modernize the appearance of buildings. This meant replacing Pueblo style with territorial style, as represented in images here, in the top two images. This style replaced round tree trunk columns and vigas with square columns that were painted white. It added front porches, pitched roofs, brick copings, and double hung windows with divided sashes. So an example of coping appears at the bottom right picture. It's the limestone along the roof line, and coping serves to visually complete the brick exterior walls. And that's all I know about coping, so I won't go into it any further. Brick was too expensive to ship before the railroad had a line to New Mexico. So Americans also painted buildings to resemble stone or brick. Boardwalks and flagstone walks were added as signs of progress as well. Once the railroad came, the architectural landscape altered even more, with buildings using brick and stone in the Italianate style in order to replace adobe structures. Houses were built with elaborate details, popular in styles of the Victorian era. Some older adobe homes were given new looks, such as gable metal roofs and white porches. Many civic and commercial buildings were simply covered up in a new style, but no new style took hold. Instead, much of Santa Fe evolved into a hodgepodge of applique, and the town wound up in the midst of an architectural identity crisis. So as mentioned in a previous slide, these so-called improvements and signs of progress and were what created this architectural identity crisis. And these are the architectural monstrosities that the editorial after Vieira's death mentioned that Vieira saved Santa Fe from. So the push for modernization led to the creation of an architectural plan for the city in order to get rid of this hodgepodge of architecture that was taking place. So just as Santa Fe seemed to be losing itself to Americanization, new and influential residents started to embrace what was being lost in the process. This included the individuals I featured earlier who had decided to bring back the old Santa Fe. Incidentally, this was the period of the City Beautiful movement in the United States. This movement was a backlash against industrialization that created a desire for nature and harmony that encouraged cities to re-beautify. Santa Fe's city leaders used this as an opportunity to revive indigenous architecture and old worldliness with the development of a style that would attract tourists and promote the new state's identity as perceived by Anglo-Americans. Instead of the City Beautiful, as other cities responded to the City Beautiful movement, Santa Fe became marketed as the City Different. State leaders wrote up the Plan of 1912, which recommended that the city only approve building permits for those reflecting the Spanish Pueblo Revival and Territorial Revival, whose features appear in the images here. The Spanish Pueblo Revival has rounded adobe walls and flat roofs held up by pine logs or vigas, which you can see sticking out in the picture on the left, on the top left. These beams are covered diagonally or at right angles with small poles or latillas, which you can more easily see displayed in the photo of the patio on the right. The inside of homes include nichos, or small arches carved into walls for displaying objects. And the bottom photo shows nichos above the fireplace and to the left of the arched doorway. Homes also have kiva fireplaces, which are rounded and placed in corners. Buildings that were reconfigured to be Americanized were brought back to their original state. With the Plan of 1912, new construction had a set of guidelines which were rigidly enforced, especially in what was deemed the historical section of town. And this is where Kate Chapman played a role in the redesign of these buildings. In this historical zone, only two styles of architecture were allowed: Spanish Pueblo Revival or Territorial Revival. These styles were meant to provide a romantic backdrop for Anglo-American tourists. The Museum of New Mexico shown here drew elements from local building traditions and is a mix of Territorial and Pueblo Revival. The buildings here are Territorial Revival, which is a blend again of Territorial and Pueblo styles. This style is more straight lined, has smooth stucco that's used as opposed to the usual rough finish and rounded edges. Brick coping is traditionally used atop the parapet walls to protect from water damage and to create a more clean lined effect, something which isn't normally seen in the Pueblo style. Milled woodwork details are also commonly found, including pedimented lintels above the window frames. Other changes that were instituted came in the late teens when Anglo-American museum staff embarked on a broader program of cultural tradition making. This included the staff's revival of Native American and Hispanic arts. They turned the annual Santa Fe Fiesta, which celebrated Don Diego de Vargas's reoccupation of Santa Fe, into a public pageant. Museum staff also fostered an art colony, which brought the likes of Carlos Vieira. This arts colony led to the later establishment of the Taos Arts Colony, which included individuals like Georgia O'Keeffe, D.H. Lawrence, and Ansel Adams. All of these changes instituted by the Anglo-American Museum staff eventually transformed New Mexico into a land of enchantment. And even though it achieved statehood in 1912, it's still seen as a foreign place. So foreign that New Mexico locals have a running joke about their perpetually foreign status. So I want to conclude this part of my presentation.
Let's get to some questions. And of course, you know,
Okay.
lost her. Yes, she's gone. I scrolled down and we have Bob, my good friend Bob and Mary. Bob, he made a comment, says, especially if they were white Protestant groups were present. I think he referred to the fact when I said, oh, health tourism of white people, white Protestants. And that's what they're trying to get into. And that's what mattered to the politicians in DC. I mean, that, you know, it was the population was too brown and too, you know, not Mexican, but too Spanish, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yes, Bob. Donna Jacobs, I'm trying to get through here now. Fascinating. I've been to Santa Fe and Taos many times and look forward to more visits. Thank you for enhancing my appreciation for New Mexican history.
Oh, you're welcome.
I agree. Tina and Jerry, thank you. Interesting presentation. Can you list the books that she referenced? Also, what were the two types of architecture? Question mark. On the Go Learn tour next in August, hopefully, will she be discussing the Native American cultures as well? Question mark. So yes. Books, we can send you the list of books. I'm making note of that.
Yes.
And then the question was architecture, the two types, and will we talk about Native American cultures?
Yes, I wanted to do this presentation first because it will kind of help inform, I think, more knowledge about Native culture in New Mexico. There are existing tensions between the three groups that still exist there. I think the Hispanic population believes that the Native peoples got too much attention and kind of felt left out, and the Native peoples are feeling some tensions because of, I mentioned Don Diego de Vargas's reoccupation of Santa Fe, and so just the troubled history of Mexico's occupation of the region. Some of those tensions still exist, and then the Americans coming in. So there's this myth of tricultural harmony that exists, but there's still kind of as I'm saying, cultural tensions taking place. So presenting this history, I think, kind of lays a foundation for then saying more about what's taking place with the Pueblos, the Navajos, what's taking place with the Hispanic population in New Mexico. And I mentioned a lot about, the Anglo-Americans' contributions to New Mexico. So it's a very rich, interesting history. So I will be talking more about Native Americans as well, especially on the Go Learn trip.
Great, nice. So yes, we will send, since you're registered for the for this webinar, we will send the books out if that's okay with Elizabeth.
Yes.
Sent me the list. We will send it out to the participants. Ruth and did I say Otto Hitler in my presentation earlier? In my talk earlier, I meant, of course, Adolf Hitler in the bunker, of course. I'm not sure why I said Otto, probably because I'm thinking about Otto the First right now. I'm doing a German history class through the Osho Lifelong Learning Institute, and that's where I got stuck right now at the Otto the First, German emperor. Quick question here from Mark. Oh, great. Mark is joining us again, I do believe, from far away. And if anybody thinks you're the furthest away, send me a message. I would like to know. Previously, we had someone from Norway, I believe.
Oh.
We actually had someone from Norway in the audience. Mark is asking, how many Harvey establishments were there and where were they? Was the movie shot on location in New Mexico and Arizona or in Hollywood? are all of the Harvey restaurants and hotels gone now?
Oh, wow. Some good questions that I don't know the answers to. Some of the hotels still exist. So like the La Fonda on the Plaza at Santa Fe that I mentioned that I think we're staying at when we take the Go Learn trip, it's still in use, but it's no longer a Harvey House.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a historic house that the company once owned. As far as numbers of houses, they weren't just in New Mexico. It followed the rail line, so anywhere from Kansas up to California. So as far as the number of houses that existed that were part of the Fred Harvey Company, I'm not sure. It was the Santa Fe, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe rail that directly went into Santa Fe off of the main rail line, which I can't think the name of that railroad line. But New Mexico worked hard to get that track going into Santa Fe to bring tourists and travelers in because they wanted to bypass Santa Fe. So you have all these influential people there that work to get that track. So you have some Harvey houses along that line as well. As far as the MGM movie, I don't know if it was.
I'm trying to look that up actually.
Yeah. Good questions. Good questions, as I would tell my students. Look them up and then come back and tell me in class when we meet next.
Plot, cast, production, songs. I heard that it received the Academy of Awards in that year for Best Song. That's as much as it got. But cast, plot, production, probably somewhere in there it's buried where it was filmed. So if you guys would like to check it out on Wikipedia, it's actually on there. A quick question from Agnes. What was the ultimate destination on Topeka-Atchison Railroad? Oops.
The ultimate destination? Well, if I'm under... Pardon?
The coast.
Oh,
I don't know.
Where did it go? I want to say Carmel County, whatever place that is named now, because there was actually some of the arts colonies traveled into, is Carmel County a place in California? And they created an arts colony in California as well. Oh, I mean, of course my mind is drawing a blank, but there's a famous Southwestern author who started in New Mexico and then walked on foot all the way to California and started that arts colony. But yes, another question. I really can't.
Yeah, I'm looking at a map, and unfortunately the map just shows the railroad and how it ultimately reaches the West Coast. And it almost connected to San Francisco as well, going north, but there's no town there. And so I can't tell you either.
And somebody's saying on the chat that Carmel is near Monterey. So is that close to San Francisco? I think that's the ultimate destination though. I'm pretty sure it was. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Becky.
All right. Let's see. Julie says, I lived in Albuquerque for 6 years and delighted in the colorful festivals, best food, the friendly people, and commitment and sharing of cultural differences. So grateful for the opportunity to live there. So that's awesome. A shout out to Albuquerque.
Yeah. It is a great place to live. I mean, there's so much to do there. And in my 5-6 years there, I still didn't see everything that I wanted to see. I thought I was going to be there forever.
And Julie says, and also everyone is welcome in New Mexico.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and Mark was pointing out that the song that I referred to earlier, and that's true, it's the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. That's true, that's the song. So that won Academy Award for Best Song. Whenever that year was that this movie came out. Judy Garland. I think we are reaching the end of our questions, if I see this correctly. Okay. So I want to thank everyone, especially Elizabeth, for being here today. And
I'm glad I got back.
Yes.
I can't wait to see what I missed when I was gone.
Yeah, we were on the last slide, so we really cut out right at the beginning of the last slide. Do you want to say anything that was not mentioned at the end, like a summary of sorts before we close? Was there anything that was important at the very end?
Yes, well, I had 2 extra slides that just contain a list of websites and of books for you to read. There's a link to that New Mexico magazine, One of Our 50 is Missing, so you can read some of those stories. They're kind of funny. I have some authors, New Mexico authors that have written stories and poetry that are based in New Mexico for you to read as well. So there are lists of websites and books and magazines and places for you to kind of explore a little more on your own after this. So those were the last 2 slides. So
Okay.
yeah.
Closing, I just want to say, Mark said, Carmel by the Sea is south of the San Francisco Bay Area near Monterey. Clint Eastwood was the mayor of Carmel at one time. Half Moon Bay is halfway between San Francisco, Monterey Bay, and may be the artist's colony. Very interesting program, says Denise. An enchanting presentation of the state. Thank you so much, says Agnes. I agree. We will send all those links and books to everyone who was here today. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Be safe this semester and beyond. And I hope we can go and travel and see New Mexico next year.
I do too.
We're working on it. We're banking on it. If the vaccine comes out, we're all getting it. So, so thank you very much for everyone here in the chat, and shout out to all the alumni who may have joined us here today, and everyone else.
And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for joining me today and sticking with me, even though I got kicked out for a minute.
Thank you. It was fantastic.
Thanks.